Growing concerns over torture in Afghanistan, doubts from a top commander, and time running out to secure the country. NATO troops are scheduled to leave Afghanistan by the end of next year, but a colonel in Kabul says the Afghan army is too weak to defeat the Taliban. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. Welcome to the programme. British Prime Minister David Cameron is hosting a key summit with Afghan and Pakistani leaders on Sunday to discuss bringing peace to Afghanistan. It's the third such meeting since last summer, but for the first time, army and intelligence chiefs from both sides will join the talks. And they've got plenty on their plates. A senior Afghan commander has warned that withdrawing British troops could spark what he called a global jihad. Colonel Amin Yan said 2014 was too early for a handover and could allow the Taliban to return to power. Jennifer Glass in Kabul is following events for Inside Story.
The state of readiness of Afghan forces, I think, is a concern here in Afghanistan. NATO officials say they have the numbers they want, 350,000 security forces across the country. But there certainly is some worry about how prepared those forces are to act on their own, which they're supposed to be doing by the end of the year. In 2013, we'll see Australian, British, New Zealand forces leave in real numbers, as well as American forces hand over security a little bit faster than we had anticipated. And not only are military chiefs concerned about the state of readiness, but also Afghan civilians as well. In 2012, we saw Afghan civilians leave in record numbers here. About 50,000 Afghan civilians left Afghanistan, worried about what the future is going to look like here. And not a small part of that is how much role the Taliban might play in any future government. Another concerning sign about the readiness of Afghanistan to stand on its own 2 feet was a recent United Nations report citing that abuse in Afghan prison and detention centers is rampant. That's caused quite a stir here. The Afghan government has called the report unfair and unfounded. The Afghan president has launched his own investigation. Human Rights Watch says the Afghan government should do all that it can to deal with this report, but says that the investigation actually doesn't include anybody with any human rights experience, and while it may be a step in the right direction, isn't enough at all to deal with these abuse allegations.
Let's bring in our guest to discuss what's happening in Afghanistan. In Kabul, Heather Barr, Afghanistan researcher in the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. From Islamabad, Mosharraf Zaidi, former advisor to Pakistan's foreign minister. And joining us from Dubai, Mark Kimmitt, former US Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Thank you all for joining us. Mark, I'm going to start off with you. These claims that withdrawing British troops from Afghanistan could likely spark a global jihad. I mean, how can there be talk about leaving when you hear claims like that from somebody on the ground, somebody who should know what's going on?
Well, first of all, I have great respect for what Colonel John has said, but I think it's important to understand that he is number 2 in a brigade, of which there are 23 brigades inside of Afghanistan. So I would suspect he is not the voice of the Afghan military, but one voice. He is a well-respected fighter from way back in Soviet days. The second point I'd make is that it's important to note that NATO is not leaving en masse. There is going to be a 10-year program to advise and assist the Afghan military. I would agree with Colonel John, if all the forces left at one time, it would in fact inspire significant violence inside of Afghanistan and could topple the Afghan National Security Forces. But what is in fact happening is that the Afghan forces are taking the lead. The NATO forces, to a great extent, will be gone, but a significant number will be there to provide assistance and enabling for years to come.
Do you think, though, that the exit strategy for NATO forces, for the US and the UK, relies on this, what the Colonel probably calls an untruth?
Well, the exit strategy depends on 2 things. Number one, a belief on the part of the military commanders on the ground as to the readiness of the Afghan National Security Forces to take the lead. The second is a sobering reminder that long wars wear on public opinions back home. So those political leaders that are making these decisions are trying to balance those two very, very important aspects.
Mosharraf, what is the feeling in Pakistan? I know you are discussing this at the moment in the UK. I mean, do you feel that there is readiness by Afghan troops to take over?
I think the Afghan troops have a ways to go in terms of their readiness, both in terms of capacity, but I'd say also in terms of the willingness and the appetite for the kind of fight that might be required if there was a free-for-all civil war in Afghanistan. But I think the bigger question is whether there is an appetite either in Afghanistan or in the broader region among those actors or those players who are allegedly interested in conflict in Afghanistan. And I would say that there's been a pretty coherent and sustained effort on the part of Afghanistan's neighbors, particularly Pakistan, but not only Pakistan, further away India, in the Central Asian region, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. I think all of these countries have repeatedly and consistently expressed what I think truthfully is a real lack of appetite for sustained violence and conflict in Afghanistan.
Because it's certainly important in your election year, isn't it, in Pakistan, to make sure that there is some sort of security on your borders?
Absolutely. Although, you know, among the issues in Pakistan on which there's broad national consensus across the different political groups, a relationship with Afghanistan that creates stability and harmony in the region is one of the areas that about which there's very little debate in Pakistan, both between the military and the civilians, as well as among the civilian actors. There's really no disagreement. The mistakes that were made in the past are seen broadly in the public domain as mistakes, and there's been a tremendous effort over the last 24 months in particular to amend those, to reach out to those Afghans who had been sidelined as far as Pakistan was concerned, those Afghans who felt that Pakistan was not their friend. Pakistan has been reaching out to those folks. And as you've seen in the last 6 months, there's been a number of things that Pakistan has done to demonstrate the seriousness of this shift in policy.
Right, we'll talk a little bit about Pakistan and the Taliban a little bit later. But Heather, what is your feeling about this withdrawal, the readiness of troops, for example? I mean, you work a lot with Afghans on the streets. Are they confident? Do they feel happy about this?
It's hard to find an Afghan these days who isn't planning an exit strategy, honestly, who isn't looking at how he will be able to get his family out of the country safely.
Really?
Obviously, there are many people who are leaving already, but there are many more who are making plans in case they need to leave in the future.
And what is their fear? What are they worried about?
I mean, the difficulty is that if you listen to what people are predicting the future is going to look like here, the scenarios range from apocalyptic to merely miserable. There aren't any scenarios that people are proposing where the situation actually gets better in the coming years. And I think that the real concern is not just the question of how the military withdrawal will impact on the situation on the ground and on human rights, but whether the military withdrawal will be accompanied with a real turning away from Afghanistan by the international community in general, in a way that involves not only drawdown of military forces, but also a withdrawal of political pressure on the Afghan government to respect human rights, and a withdrawal of aid funding that funds services that are crucial for human rights in Afghanistan.
Mark, you seem to agree with that?
Well, I really do. I think Heather brings up an excellent point. I just returned from Baghdad, having been there for the last few days, and I'm struck by the amount of disengagement, not simply militarily, but politically and diplomatically, that one can see on the ground. One takes a look at the situation on the ground right now, the dispute that's going on between the central government and the Anbaris, between the central government and the Kurds, between the central government and his own people in the Sadrist party. And I would suspect that a few years ago, had there been a significant amount of international focus on Iraq, the instability that we're seeing in Iraq today would not be going on. But this withdrawal, not simply militarily, but diplomatically, and quite frankly, in the zeitgeist of the foreign countries, I think we'll have as much trouble in Afghanistan as we see in Iraq today.
I mean, this probably confirms your fear, just one aspect, Mark. I mean, the latest UN report on torture in Afghanistan, which Heather touched on just briefly, follows on from a similar study 12 months earlier. It concluded there'd been no significant reduction in prisoner abuse, which it said remained rampant in detention centres run by Afghan intelligence services. It found credible and reliable evidence that 326 of 635 detainees interviewed had been tortured or ill-treated, and nearly a quarter of them were children. 14 different forms of torture were reported: suspension from ceilings, prolonged and severe beatings, electric shocks, and the threat of execution and rape. And the report condemned NATO forces for ignoring the abuses. The Afghan government has criticised the report as one-sided and exaggerated, but has nevertheless ordered an investigation. Heather, do you agree that this report is possibly one-sided?
No, I don't agree. I mean, these allegations are not new. There's been documentation of serious and widespread torture happening in Afghan prisons, dating back really since the early days following the end of the Taliban administration. And we've seen over those years a real reluctance by the Karzai government to take meaningful steps to end torture. And I think we've also seen a failure by the international community to make this a priority issue. And so here we are at the end of the international engagement, leaving a country where torture is as endemic as it was when the international community arrived. And I think that this relates
nobody's
to a
ever been held
broader
accountable,
failure.
have they? So this is not likely to change anytime soon.
No, I think that we're facing the possibility that the human rights situation in Afghanistan may in fact get worse in the coming years, not just in regard to torture, but even on really basic indicators like infant mortality, maternal mortality, school enrollment, literacy. I think that if you look at how there has been some significant progress in some areas of human rights, but it's been related to international pressure and international funding, both of which we may be seeing disappear very quickly.
Mark, where was the international community here? I mean, particularly amongst the forces in the country. They were aware of these allegations for years. How come nothing was done?
Well, my suspicion is that what the international community has relied upon is the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, to do the inspections and to give the feedback directly to the people in charge. It has been the norm and been the practice in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan that the ICRC is somewhat the gold standard for consistency and reliability in terms of those reports. I would simply say these allegations should have the opportunity to be investigated. And frankly, if the investigation bears out, if there's been any malpractice or torture that goes on, the people that have been responsible for that should be punished severely.
Mosharraf, you were shaking your head. What do you disagree with there?
Well, no, I don't disagree with much, but I think, I'm just confused as to why this should be any surprise. The current sort of military infrastructure and law enforcement infrastructure in Afghanistan has been put in place by the U.S., NATO, ISAF. And, Zero Dark 30, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay. I don't think that there should be any big surprise that the methods that the Afghans would use would reflect similar methods as to the ones that have been used by the U.S. in pursuit of its counter-terror objectives.
Is that key here, Heather, that they've learned from the best?
Well, I just wanted to add that countries that have signed on to the Convention Against Torture have a legal obligation not to hand over people to a government where they believe they may be tortured. And the role of the ICRC, while it's incredibly valuable here, and as it is in many countries around the world, doesn't change that. It's still the responsibility of the government that's handing over the prisoner. And we've seen responses by ISAF in terms of suspending transfers temporarily to specific facilities, but I think that hasn't been accompanied with a real political will to address this issue at the highest levels with President Karzai.
Let's stick with torture.
The whole thing,
sorry, go ahead, Mark.
There's a real problem here because we're trying to apply normative frameworks in a context that in which they don't really work. There is an assumption of moral asymmetry between Afghanistan and other actors here, and I just don't see that moral asymmetry. I think that the use of torture is something that has been a part of the global counterterror infrastructure since 9/11, led by the U.S., and therefore client states, proxy forces of the U.S. are more than likely to repeat those. And so that's what we've seen, not just in Afghanistan, but indeed in Pakistan, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Yemen. We've seen a repeat of this over and over again. So I think that, putting Afghanistan or the Afghan government in our sort of sights on an issue that really emanates from U.S. policy is fundamentally unfair.
Mark, what is your response to that the U.S. is to blame?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I mean, to suggest somehow that torture was a state policy or a national policy of the United States, it's not only baseless, it's offensive, and it doesn't square with the facts. That may go well beyond the subject at hand for today, but I think somebody's been watching too many movies and hasn't been reading enough of the accurate reports that have been coming out over the years.
Well, there have been many allegations against torture by the U.S., haven't there?
Well, there have been, and I was in Iraq when there were allegations at Abu Ghraib, and there were suggestions that somehow what happened at Abu Ghraib was state-sponsored and it was part of a national policy to extract information from the Iraqi prisoners.
Were those soldiers U.S. soldiers? Were those soldiers U.S. soldiers, Mark, or were they?
They absolutely were
from some other country. Okay.
They were U.S. soldiers, and they were also found to be.
U.S. soldiers and U.S. intelligence operatives around the world have used torture to extract information in pursuit of counterterror objectives. What's the problem?
No, I don't agree at all. I don't agree at all. The fact is, Abu Ghraib demonstrated that this was not a systemic policy being used.
Facts aren't up to agreement or disagreement. Facts are what they are. They're black and white. It's 0-1. It's binary. So whether you agree with a fact or not doesn't change the existence of the fact.
Right, let's move this on, gentlemen. Heather, what are your concerns if the Taliban take over?
I think that human rights activists and people who've spoken out against the Taliban, even just women and girls who participated in public life, gone to school, are afraid of what, on a community level, it may mean if the territory that's controlled by the Taliban expands in the short term during the security transition, and if the Taliban gains power in the government through some kind of peace negotiation in the longer term. And I think that one of the things that's really been preying on the mind of women's rights activists is the enormous efforts they've been trying to make sure that when there are negotiations with the Taliban, women's interests and women themselves are represented at the table. And they've had very little success at trying to make that happen.
Mosharraf, I know that the Pakistan security forces agree with the potential Taliban threat if there is some sort of security vacuum. The ISI predicts that 5 million Afghans who've worked or had links with the Afghan government shall be killed or imprisoned, and more than 5 million will flee their country. I mean, those are shocking statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to what, the predictions that are being made by the ISI, but there is no question that if there is an all-out civil war in Afghanistan, the brunt of the pressure and the sort of spillover of that will be felt by Pakistan, as it has for the last 35 years. I think that, the fact is the human rights situation in Afghanistan has, in fact, been better than it was under the Taliban since 2001. But it hasn't been perfect, and there have been many, many instances where the international community could have pressured President Karzai and the Afghan administration to do more. And now we're kind of looking down the barrel of a gun and hoping that negotiations with the Taliban will yield some positives. I've heard that there were some positive things that were said by the Taliban recently in the Paris discussions or negotiations, if you will. But it seems unlikely, given the fact that the situation has been as bad as it has since 2001, despite being an improvement on the Taliban rule, that things will get much better. I think the one positive we can extract is that the existence of this time period since 2001 has helped solidify and strengthen Afghan civil society and the Afghan media. And so I think there's a lot of indigenous, organic Afghan voices that will be very loud and very clear about the defense of human rights. And so
okay,
that's
in defense
one
of the country, obviously it needs a strong army, it needs a strong police force, and we're not really seeing that at the moment. I mean, more than 3,000 foreign troops have died in the Afghan conflict since 2001, but while the number of coalition casualties is falling, more Afghans are now in the firing line. Latest figures show that more than 1,200 Afghan soldiers died in 2012. That's up from 550 the previous year, and more soldiers are giving up the fight on average, some 4,800 every month. In the past 3 months, the rate of desertion exceeded recruitment, leaving the army below its target force of 185,000. Mark, that's going to make it very difficult for troops to withdraw if the Afghan army is halving in size.
No, I think that's right. And the number of Afghan soldiers deserting has been somewhat constant over the years. The numbers that are being recruited is somewhat constant over the years. So there has been an ability to maintain somewhat of a steady state quantity of soldiers. But if you go back to an earlier comment by Mosharraf, which I think was exactly right, a lot depends on their willingness to fight and their capability to fight. Is this a government that they're going to fight for? Is this a government that they're going to rally behind? Or after the central government doesn't make progress on Taliban reconciliation, and after the international community departs,
and also, I mean, the Taliban has got increasingly successful, Mark. So, sorry, excuse me interrupting you. The Taliban's got increasingly successful at these targeted attacks within the Afghan forces. That's obviously a worry, this new tactic?
Oh, it's a worrisome tactic. But listen, at the end of the day, there is enough military capacity within Afghanistan to hold back the Taliban. The aircraft that they have, the artillery that they have, the advanced weaponry that they have is simply enough to maintain an adequate defense against the Taliban. But none of that is worthwhile if the soldiers aren't willing to fight. So that's why well-trained soldiers are one component, but a political path towards peace is another component. And that's where President Karzai comes in. That's where his government comes in. That's where talks with the Taliban come in. If the soldiers don't believe in what they're fighting for, they just simply won't fight.
Heather?
I mean, I think one of the things that's frustrating about the way this security transition process has gone forward is we've seen a major effort to monitor numbers of attacks, numbers of casualties, but what we're not seeing is any tracking of other indicators that would tell us in more real terms about human security. Things like clinic attendance, school attendance, freedom of movement, especially for women and girls. And so I think it's very, very opaque in terms of how the experience has been of Afghans living on the ground in areas that have been transitioned. And the decline in security incidents in some of these areas is likely to be more about an accommodation reached between the Afghan forces and the Taliban than about
so your prognosis is pretty
of the Afghan
gloomy
forces.
For the immediate future of the country, isn't it?
I just wanted to mention a quote that I read today, which was by a former U.S. ambassador who said, "We're not winding down this war, we're winding down our participation in this war, and that's an extraordinarily different thing," which I think is worth remembering. The departure of the international forces has nothing to do with the war ending, and that's what Afghans are well aware of.
So, Mosharraf, is it all doom and gloom? Do you think anything can come out of this summit that'll salvage the situation?
I think there's been a sort of unrelenting effort on the part of many countries, Pakistan, the US, the UK, Turkey, and others are now entering the fray. Qatar is one of them. I think that there is, at least, within governments, there is a recognition that this can be salvaged, that we mustn't necessarily be talking about violence post-2014. That it's possible that after a reconciliation process, the Taliban and other parts of the Afghan state will find some compact, some way of coming together, and so that we won't be talking about fighting, but we'll be talking about adjustment and, share of the spoils, if you will, and means of, generating revenue. So I don't think that it's all necessarily 100% gloomy.
Let's leave it on that positive note. Mosharraf Zaidi with those final comments. Thanks to Heather Barr and Mark Kimmitt. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. You can see this program again and many others by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, and follow the links. You can leave your feedback there too. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.